Hello everyone. In this particular video, we will discuss the various types of data. So before starting this session, if I will ask you what are the types of data, then some students will say, sir, there are two types of data. The first one is primary data and the second one is secondary data. Yes, exactly. You are totally correct. And some other students will say, sir, again there are two types of data. The first one is qualitative data and the second one is quantitative data. Again, they are also correct. But in this particular video, we will see the types of data from the econometric perspective. So let us start. So before going to the econometric classification of data, let us discuss the basic types of data. So if we will put the head collection for the classification of data, that means if we are classifying the data on the basis of collection, then there are two types of data. The first one is primary data and the second one is secondary data. So primary data is originally obtained and newly documented data that is collected from the various methods like survey, interview, focus groups, etc. Whereas the secondary data relies on existing sources such as financial reports, sales reports, government reports, internet, books, magazines, etc. So for research, if someone is collecting the data by himself or herself by using various methods like questionnaire, interviews, Google Forms, then that data is considered as primary data. Whereas if he is collecting the data from some other sources, then that data is known as secondary data. Now coming to the next slide. So if we will choose nature as the classification of data, then again there are two types of data. The first one is quantitative data and the second one is qualitative data. So quantitative data is anything that can be counted or measured, and it refers to the numerical data. Whereas the qualitative data is descriptive, referring to the things that can be observed but not measured, such as color or emotion. Let us take an example. If I will say that my height is 5 foot 9 inches, then that is a quantitative data. And if I'll say that my skin color is brown or white or whatever it is, then that is known as qualitative data. So we cannot measure that quality in terms of or we cannot count that, or we cannot measure that in numbers. So that is known as qualitative data. But if we can measure that particular data in terms of numbers, or we can count that data, then that is known as quantitative data. So if we are classifying the data on the basis of collection, then there are two types of data. The first one is primary data and the second one is secondary data. Whereas if we are classifying the data on the basis of nature, then there are two types of data. The first one is qualitative data and the second one is quantitative data. So let us see the classification of data on the basis of time and entity. That is the primary concern for the econometric perspective of classification of data. So there are basically four types of data from the econometric perspective. The first one is time series data, the second one is cross-sectional data, the third one is pooled data, and the fourth one is panel data. So rather than going to the definitions and other explanation, let us understand this concept with an example. So let's say if you want to collect the data of a person whose name is Mr. A, and you want to collect the three different variables. The first one is his income and his expenses and savings. So savings is simply just income minus expenses, that is savings. So we are basically focusing on the savings. So let's say we have collected his savings in the month of January, February, March, April, May and June. So here there is just one entity, that is Mr. A. Okay, and we have collected the data for the several time periods, that is January, February, March, April, May and June. That means 6 months. That means the time frame is more than one. Okay, so this type of data where there is just one entity and the time frame or the time is more than one, that is known as the time series data. So time series data is the data that is recorded over the consistent intervals of time, and it is a sequence of data points that occurs in successive order over some period of time. That means here the basic concept, if you have to collect the data for one entity, or you can also collect for more than one entity, but the basic criteria is there is one entity and more than one time periods. So this type of data is known as time series data. Let's say we are collecting the data over for Mr. A or someone other for the in the year 2020, 21, 22, 23 and so on. So time periods are more than one. So this type of data is known as time series data. So let's take a practical example. Suppose we want India's GDP as our data. So we are considering India as one entity and GDP for the variable whose data we are considering from 2019 to 2023. So here we have taken 2019-20's India GDP, then 2021, 21, 22 and 22, 23. So here there is just one entity and the time period is more than one. So this type of data is known as the time series data. So this is the practical example of time series data. Here we can also plot this in graphical presentation. So this is the time plot of this GDP, and this is the histogram for the GDP from the year 2019 to 2023. So I hope time series data is clear. Let's move to the next one. So the next one is our cross-sectional data. So let us understand this with an example. So in the previous case where we have taken the time series data, we have considered one entity for the different time periods. But for the cross-sectional data, we have just one time period, that is January 2024. And we have four different entities, that is Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C and Mr. D. And we have the variables like income, expenses, and finally we are getting our savings. So savings is our main variable. So here the main concept is there is more than one entity and the time frame should be one. That means the same time frame. That is this is a kind of a comparative analysis. Suppose in the month of January you want to compare that what are the savings of these four persons, that means four entities or four individuals. So this type of data where there is more than one entity and the time frame is one or the same is known as the cross-sectional data. So cross-sectional data is a type of data collected by observing many subjects such as individuals, farms, countries or regions at a single point or period of time, and it consists of several variables recorded at the same time. So the basic concept is there is more than one entity and the time frame is one, and it is just opposite of the time series data where we have just one entity and the time frames are more than one, whereas in the cross-sectional data there are more than one entities and the time frame is one. So this type of data is known as cross-sectional data, which is very much used for the comparative analysis. Suppose if a researcher want to know what is the performance of IT companies in the year 2020, in the during the COVID pandemic year. So he will take the data in the year 2020 of many IT companies and he can compare this data. So this type of data is known as cross-sectional data. So let us take a practical example. Suppose we have considered GDP for the different countries in the same year 2020 and 21, that is India, Sri Lanka, China and Pakistan. Or we can also present this in this format. So the time frame is same, that is 2020-21, and there are different four entities, that are India, Sri Lanka, China and Pakistan, and we have plotted this in this histogram, and this type of data is known as cross-sectional data. Okay, Now coming to the third one, that is known as the pooled data. Now before starting this, there is a confusion that pooled data and panel data are same, but not. These are not the same thing. There is a slight difference between pooled data and the panel data. Let us discuss and then we will able to understand the difference. First of all, let us say that in the previous two cases, that is the time series data, we have one entity and different time periods, whereas in the cross-sectional data we have uh, one time period and more than one entities, whereas the pooled data says that more than one entity and the time frame is also more than one. That is the basic concept behind it. And there is one more thing, that is the entities will be random. That means we can choose any of these entities. There is no repetitive term between these entities. That is the basic difference between a pooled data and a panel data. Let us understand with this example. Let us say we want to take the data of different entities such as Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C, Mr. D, Mr. E and Mr. F. So there are 6 entities. That means one more than one entity. Whereas the time frame we have considered January 2024, then Feb, March, April, May and June. So there are more than one time frames also. So this type of data is basically known as the pooled data, but the criteria is random. If the entities are random, that means there is no repetitive form of these entities. That means we are not collecting the data in the month of January for Mr. A, and again for B we are collecting the other person, that means the other entity. There is no repetitive term in this time frame of these entities. Okay, so let's understood the pool data occurs when we have a time series of cross sectional. That means both are coming time series of cross sectional, but the observation in each cross sectional do not necessarily refer the same unit. That is the key point or the key difference between a pool data and a panel data, and it is combination of both time series and the cross sectional data. That means more than one entities and more than one time period. But the basic thing is we have to look after this, that the entities are random. That means there is no repetitive term between these entities. So let's take a practical example again. So this is the practical example of pool data. Suppose we want the GDP of all these entities, that are the countries, that is India, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan and Myanmar. Okay, and the time periods are also different. That means 2017, 18, then 18, 19, 19, 20, 20, 21, 21, 22 and 22, 23. And these are the GDPs. That means there is more than one entity and the time frame is also more than one. But the basic thing is the countries are not repetitive in nature. That means in 2017-18 we have taken the data of India's GDP, but in all of this following time periods we are not considering India for repetitive times. That means we are just considering for one time, that is selected as randomly. That is known as the pooled data. Okay, now coming to the next one, that is the panel data. And there is the same thing, there are more than one entities and the time period is also more than one. But the basic difference between a pooled data and a panel data is here the entity will be repetitive, whereas in the previous case the entities are random, whereas in the case of panel data the entities will be repetitive. Let us understand this with an example. So let's take this as an example. We have considered Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C and Mr. D. These are the 4 entities or the 4 individuals. That means more than one entities. And we have considered variables like income and expenses, and finally we got our savings. Okay, so we have the different time frames, that is January 2024, February 24 and March 24, and these are all in repetitive for all these 3 persons. That means For in the month of January 2024, we are collecting the data of Mr. A, and again for the January 2024 we are collecting the data for Mr. B, and for Jan 2024 again C, and Jan 2024 Mr. D. And all these entities are repetitive means these four entities are coming in all these time plots, right? All these time slaves. That means Mr. A is coming in January, February, March, whereas Mr. B is also coming in Jan, Feb and March, Mr. C similarly, and Mr. D similarly. So they are repetitive in nature. So this kind of data is known as the panel data. So panel data refers to the multidimensional data that generally involves measurement over some period of time. Whereas if it was a pool data, then there will be no repetitive in nature. Suppose in the month of January we have collected the data for Mr. A, then in the month of February we will not be collecting the data of Mr. A. We will be considering Mr. B or Mr. C or any other person. So there will be no repetitive term in the pooled data, but there will be the repetitive term of entities in the case of panel data. That is the basic difference between a pooled data and a panel data. So let us take example. Suppose we want to analyze the GDP of these four entities or four countries, that are India, China, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. So we are selecting the time frame for the time period 2021 to 22-23. So we are collecting the data of India in the year 2021, and for again 21-22 and 22-23, and again for the China the same time periods, and for the Sri Lanka same three time periods, and for Pakistan again same three time periods, and we have collected all these GDPs. So this type of data is known as the panel data, whereas we can also show this data in this format. For the year 2020 one, we have collected this four countries data, and for the year 21-22 again in the similar way we have collected this data, and 22-23 we have collected this much of data. So this type of data where the entities are repetitive in form is known as the panel data. So finally, let us compare all these four types of data to have a better understanding. So the first one is our time series data. So in the time series data, we have just one entity, that is India, and there are more than one time periods, that are 2019-20, 2021, 21-22 and 22-23. So there is just one entity and more than one time period. So this type of data is known as time series data. Whereas the second one is the cross-sectional data, which is just the opposite of the time series data. In this case, there is just one time period and more than one entities, that are India, Sri Lanka, China and Pakistan. So there is one time period and more than one entities. So this type of data is known as cross-sectional data. Now coming to the third one, that is our pooled data. So pooled data is a mixture of, or the merger of, time series data and the cross-sectional data. So in this case we have more than one entities, that are India, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan and Myanmar. Whereas there is more than one time periods as well. So there are more than one time periods, that are 17, 18, 18, 19 and so on. But there is one more characteristic of pooled data, that is the entities are random. That means they are not in repetitive nature. That means for the first year we have considered India as our entity. That means in this upcoming year we are not going to consider India as our entity. So we have considered the other entity for our second year and the another one for the third year and so on. That means all in whole this time frame the entities are not in repetitive nature. That means for all this year we have a separate entity for a particular time frame. So this type of data is known as pooled data. Whereas the fourth one is panel data. The panel data is just similar like pool data, but there is just a slight difference. So in this case we have more than one entity, that are India, China, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Whereas there is more than one time frames as well, that is 2020, 21, 21, 22 and 22, 23. But the basic difference is that the entities are repetitive in nature. That means for the first year we have considered India, and for the second year again we have considered India, and for the third year again we are considering India as our entity, and same for other countries as well. So the entities that we have taken are repetitive in nature for the selected time period. That means the particular entity is coming in all those time periods. That means they are in repetitive nature. So this type of data is known as the panel data. So I hope it is clear that what is time series data, what is sectional, cross-sectional data, what is pool data, and what is panel data, and what is the basic difference between a pool data and panel data. And apart from that, I'll also say that is not the end of classification of data. There are other types of data as well, but I have tried to cover, or I have tried to discuss these four types of data from the econometric perspective, to have an understanding of what are the types of data for our research purposes. So that is all for this particular video. Thank you everyone, thank you for watching this video.